So today's session will be exploring the reflections and foresights of 3 leaders in CED who are retiring this year. It's brought to you by the Canadian Community Economic Development Network. We're a network of several hundred community organizations and individuals working to create local economic opportunities that support an inclusive and sustainable economy. Here you can see just a few of our members' logos. If you like the session today, consider joining us by becoming a member or signing up for our free e-newsletter so you can keep up to date with everything we have going on. Perfect. So this webinar is part of a series. Some of our past sessions have included topics such as youth employment, social return on investment, the resilience imperative, social impact bonds, financial management for sustainability, mutuals for microfinance, and many others. All of these past sessions are also on our website, so you can check those out. So here on this page, you see a picture of myself, your host, and our first presenter, Walter Hossli. Today's webinar is going to be divided into 2 parts. So we're actually going to ask sort of 2 questions. So today, to start, we'll have the presentation by Walter. Oops, sorry. Oh, and I thought I wasn't clicking the slides, but are we okay with the slides? Good. Sorry. So today we'll have presentations by Walter, David, and Lynne. So those will last about 30 minutes. And we'll start by hearing from each of them on the biggest changes and lessons learned over their careers to date. Then the discussion will shift to looking forward, and we'll ask them what they see as the most strategic opportunities or areas for impact in our field today. Then in the second part, I'll ask them the questions you have posed in the chat box. So once again, just feel free to post any questions, comments, and any other information you'd like to share at any time. So before we get into the presentations, let's get a sense of who we have on our webinar today with 2 quick polls of participants. So you should see the 2 questions pop up on your screen. So question 1 and question 2. So please just if you're able to answer those now. And so while you're answering those, I'll do a little bit of my intro for the session. So the start of a new year is often a time for looking back and looking forward. But 2014 also marks a major turning point in the lives of 3 longtime Canadian leaders in the fields of cooperative social enterprise and CED. Over many years of dedication, Lynne Markell, David LePage, and Walter Hossli have played an integral role in the growth and development of CED in Canada. So we wanted to start our 2014 webinar series by sharing some insights from these 3 leaders on their experience and vision for the future. In this session, we're going to reflect on the biggest changes our presenters have seen over their careers, the most important lessons they've learned, and where they see exciting opportunities in the field today. But before we start with Walter, let's just check back on our poll results. It looks like in terms of personal involvement in CED, we have 66% are mostly looking forward, a lot of summers in between. And we have one who, in their day, they had to walk to school, and it was uphill both ways. Perfect. Perfect. So more seriously, I look forward to the day when new tools are at our fingerprints or fingertips, and CED is seen to be a full-fledged movement with buy-in by government and funders, and people are able to connect more easily. And employment for all. That's awesome. Great responses. I agree with all of those. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Walter Hossli. Walter has been an executive director of Momentum since it was founded in 1991. Under his leadership, Momentum has won the Community Achievement Award from the City of Calgary, been recognized by the Tides Canada Foundation, by Charity Intelligence as one of the most effective organizations in Calgary, and named one of Alberta's top 50 employers. Walter is a founding board member of CCEDNet, and he helped establish Vibrant Communities Calgary, an organization dedicated to fighting poverty, and one of my favorite organizations across Canada as well. So thank you for joining us, Walter.
Thank you, Marianne. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm hoping to stay as relevant as possible to folks wanting to look into the future. So having said that, I want to reflect a little bit on the surprises I think that I have discovered over time about the sector as I learned more about it across the country. My number of years on the board of CCEDNet have certainly given me insight in that regard. So the first point I want to make is that we are a highly diverse movement, or sometimes we identify ourselves as a movement, CD movement, if you will, or a sector. And often I don't think we truly appreciate diversity and how that influences where we are at. So let's just think about, you know, we have provincial, regional, rural, local, and, you know, geographic differences that make our reality profoundly different from place to place. We have women's organizations. We have organizations that focus on young people. We have funders among the people that are members of CCEDNet. We have organizations that solely focus on community economic development, or we have neighborhoods that organize themselves. We have organizations that only part of their work, you know, we have a community kitchen here in Calgary, for example, hosted by an immigrant serving organization, so only that part of their organization would see themselves as a community economic development organization. So what that leaves us with is that it's difficult to find a common agenda. So we shouldn't be too harsh on ourselves when CCEDNet and those of us that are active with CCEDNet find it challenging to come up with a truly meaningful strategic plan or a strategic direction. We should just continue to work at it and continue to find common denominators. The second point I wanted to make is that our work overall, for me, boils down to two basic pillars: people and money. And when I sharpen in on those two, it's in many ways about the key staff that are active in our local community economic development organizations that it's about. And the better, the more professional, the more informed, the more passionate, the more dedicated, reliable, and so forth, all those wonderful things that we look for in good employees, the better we are able to move the needle. And the further, the more committed we can make a difference. On the other hand, it's a real seesaw, this whole thing, people and money, because it takes a good amount of resources to hire those kind of folks these days. And that really has changed in my 20 years doing this kind of work. The simple fact is that people have much larger mortgages today than they did 20, 25 years ago. And for us to be able to employ professionals, we have to pay decent salaries so that they're able to just pay the bills. So in order for us to be competitive in the labor market, we have to also treat people with a sense of respect. So at Momentum, we've worked really hard at challenging ourselves to be a top employer, an employer of choice, and that's really helped us. So that seesaw between people and money is an ongoing challenge and something that took me a while to figure out and zero in on. The third point I wanted to make is that over time, the key players have changed many times. Funders, particularly government funders, the political reality is such in Canada that things keep changing between province and the feds, and the rise of the cities is a newer movement in the last 10 years where the cities have more influence. So as these powers shift, we have to be prepared to adapt our approaches and go, in other words, stay diverse enough so that we're not vulnerable when a funder discontinues a certain, what I like to call flavor of the month. When we saw this, for example, with micro-lending, was really the big thing in the mid-90s. Today, hardly anyone looks for micro-lending funding opportunities as a funder. But at the same time, it's as relevant today as it was back then. So those are kind of my key points about what I have learned about the sector. Now, what I learned about myself in this time is probably a bit more interesting for all of you to listen to because it's more personal. I first got into the professional work in a paid form as a draftsperson in an architectural company. And that has given me an opportunity to really understand or work with the private sector and be focused on the bottom line, as it were. Later, I went back to school and took social work, and that's really served me well in my leadership capacity. And I say that because, as all of you will appreciate, first and foremost, this is a people business, and unless we're able to successfully connect with people at an emotional level, it's really difficult to lead an organization successfully. So it's helped me to have that kind of focus, and at the same time, I have this thing, sometimes people tell me that my middle name is P for persistence, and it's a bit of a liability because I tend to come across as stubborn at times, but at the same time, I also know that that's been a real help, is not to give up and not to take no for an answer, particularly when it comes to going after funding in the long term. The other part that I learned about myself is that my preoccupation with money and with business has served me really well. You know, when I look at the newspaper, the first page I flip to is the business section. That's just kind of how I think and how I work, and that's really served me well in this leadership position. I tend to be anxious about money and being able to pay the bills, so I pay a lot of attention there. And it saddens me to hear when other organizations are not successful because they couldn't get it right on the money side. I think that's a skill and a discipline that we simply need to be able to master if we are to be taken seriously as CED organizations. That's a personal pet peeve of mine, is to pay attention to money, and CED in many ways is about adding the dimension of money to the dimension of social work, if you will. I also have learned, probably in the last 5 to 10 years more, that I really have gotten a lot of energy from working with young people. We have many very energetic and dedicated young people that have joined the movement and are really passionate about making a difference in today's complex and sometimes depressingly negative world. And that's been a real shot in the arm for me in the last few years, to watch them grow and dedicate their life to a career in a movement that seems as, in some ways from a mainstream perspective, as marginal as we sometimes make ourselves to be. And it's been a real encouragement for me to be among people who are only half or less than half my age, and to see how they're ready to run with the baton. So that's it for me for now. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Walter. And definitely what you say follows through with your work, because everybody I meet who is involved with Momentum just raves about being employed there. So awesome work.
Thanks.
Now it's my pleasure to introduce David LePage. David is a principal with Accelerating Social Impact CCC Limited, one of Canada's first hybrid corporations, created to serve the emerging blended value business and social finance sectors. Until recently, David was a team manager of Enterprising Nonprofits BC and played a lead role in the development of ENP Canada. His many involvements include chair of the Social Enterprise Council of Canada, a member of the Social Enterprise World Forum Steering Group, the Canadian CED Network Policy Council, Imagine Canada's Advisory Committee, and BC's Partners for Social Impact. So thank you for joining us, David.
Great. Thank you, Joanne. This is a great opportunity. Walter, love listening to you. So to move the slides forward. There we go. So there were a couple questions that we were asked to answer, and one of them, what is the biggest change during the time in working? And my career goes back in CED, quite a long time, to the very early 1970s, working in the inner city in the U.S. And one of the things that that strikes me is that, you know, there was a time when community economic development was just emerging, and we were trying to work with cities and with governments, and we found that their focus was really on how do you get more, what was referred to then as smokestacks, how do you get more factories, more commercial activity. And now it seems like to me a lot of that energy is that it really hasn't changed, just has another name, and now we chase the, you know, high-tech industry instead of smokestacks. But it's the same dynamics that we've had before, which is we still are not addressing things like economic stratification and social inequality, because those are the issues that in my mind are what's important, and we keep chasing these economic activities without understanding how they are related to community. And so whether it's, you know, a high-tech company that comes in and creates a lot of high-end jobs, but, you know, then the people cleaning that office are getting paid below minimum wage because they're the sixth derivative down on a major contract for a corporation. But we go around saying, well, look how great the economy is doing. We've got these high-tech industries in this community, or we've got, you know, I think Ontario just promised, you know, Cisco $60 million or $120 million for 1,000 jobs. And I'm like going, wow, that's 100,000 a job. But what does that mean in terms of the actual economic development? So that to me reflects the fact, the second point, which is we rarely have a really integrated CED approach on these issues, that what we really have is this continuation of keeping separate environment housing. And I think that is something that is the biggest challenge that we've got to be more conscious of. And then that flows into my third point, which is we do have moments and spots of successes, but we still haven't reached that point of cohesive and collective CED analysis that can move from like the 30 or 40 of us on this conversation who are really, you know, sort of this is what we do every day inside and out, whether you're working at the Learning Enrichment Foundation or working in government in Nova Scotia or, you know, the federal government. I mean, there's individuals who are working this, but we haven't quite moved it to a larger thing. So I think on a larger picture from CED, those are some of the challenges I've seen, is that there just hasn't been enough change for what I would like to have seen. And so the next slide, we talk about things I've learned, and the first one is really kind of interesting because I think what's really important is we've got to integrate a spiritual piece along with an organizing piece. And so we were chatting before this, and Mike Toy said, I don't think I've seen anyone like integrate, you know, the Bhagavad Gita with Saul Alinsky. But that to me is sort of like what we have to have. We have to have a personal reason we're doing this. And for me, the Bhagavad Gita speaks to, we do our duty regardless of the outcome, but that duty for me means how do you look at things from a systems analysis, from an effective thing. So people like Saul Alinsky, Albert Camus, Karl Marx, Peter Drucker, Fritjof Capra are some of the people who I've read and learned from over so many years, and they're still the books that you know, some of the copies I've had and carried with me for years, because those are the sort of inspiration from both a spiritual and an organizing point. And it's interesting that Walter, one of his key words he talked about was persistence, and I look at it the same way, is I, you know, focus, be patient, and be persistent. And I think those to me are really, really key. You've got to realize what you're trying to achieve. And so going to meetings, it's really nice. The research is valuable, but we really have to be focused on getting something done. So that's my reflections. So thanks very much, Marianne, and back to you.
Thank you very much, David. And it's I now work, in my position, I now work with somebody who learned a lot and worked a lot with David, so I feel like sometimes I am getting a lot of his teachings through through the process as well, so thank you, David. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Lynne Markell. Until her retirement in December, Lynne had been at the Canadian Cooperative Association for more than 10 years, focused on government affairs, public policy, and co-op development. Prior to CCA, Lynne had a long experience in the community economic development sector and was a former CCEDNet board member and has been active on CCEDNet's Policy Council. Thanks for joining us, Lynne.
Glad to be here. This is really fun. I have been involved, as David talked about, in CED for quite a long time. And when I was helping to organize the Women's Credit Union, I didn't even know that what we were doing as a group of women, low-income women and middle-class women, that this was a community-based economic development project. I know nothing about credit unions, and I was really been very lucky to be able to get my master's degree in CED by going to training programs and meeting very experienced people who taught me a lot. And for that, I also need to mention Mike Lewis, who has been quite a guru in CED in Canada. I'm going to go quickly to the biggest changes that I have seen in my 35 years, and I think I'm following what David has also said, in that there are lots of players involved in CED, but we don't have this unified movement and an overall awareness that what we're doing is part of a community-based economic development movement or an approach, which is that community knows best. Community people need to be involved in designing the programs, the activities that are going to grow their local economy, and they need to do that in cooperation with a wide variety of partners, including business and municipalities and so on. So in a sense, what we have today is we have a lot of people doing work under this broad umbrella, or sometimes not even under the umbrella, and they are doing fascinating stuff. And I commend people, the amount of activity that's going on in this country that I would define as community economic development is amazing. But people are often working in their own specialties, and they are working they're attached to their own particular project. It could be a food co-op or an enterprise or a small business program or even a major environmental program like solar energy or something like that. But they aren't necessarily working together in their local region or city or whatever, and under an umbrella of a broad plan, a strategic plan. And that, to me, is the best way to do community economic development, is people come together, develop a long-term plan, and then everybody take their job and their role to carry that out. The second thing that I've really seen as a major change is the role of the federal government, and Walter certainly pointed to that when he talked about the rise of importance of provincial governments and particularly municipal government. At the time when I was involved in the 70s and even early 80s, the federal government and the federal government departments particularly were involved a lot. And when I look back at a book that was written by David Pell and Susan Wismer on community profit, the resources in the back of that book that came out in 1980 include a lot of federal government departments. And there were things around that would support CED. There were even pilot projects and so on that helped get new things started, such as New Dawn. There was actually federal money that went into 5 years worth of funding to help them get started. We don't see that today. We see lack of money has been cut back at the federal government. Don't see very much respect for community-based economic development, the role of community. Very much big projects, international development, liking very large organizations to take over rather than money going down to local-based community economic development. And what we've also seen is this attention to social finance and social enterprise with a lot of new players, some of whom who haven't necessarily bought into a broad CED approach, trying to do things, business, and so on. But I think from the federal government point of view, not from the players, but from the federal government point of view, I think they're doing this in order to reduce government expenditures for disadvantaged populations, and they're looking for some quick fixes as a way to be able to help these people in another way. The things that I've learned in the time period that I want to pass on to others is that I think that these are very practical kinds of things, and as a person who sees CED as making a difference, I think it's really important for people to remember how important writing is, that we need to put out, when we do funding proposals or publications or PowerPoints, it's really important to be clear and simple. I have found that in trying to get money, that if I have a 1 or 2 pager describing the program I want to do and how much the money I need, actually a bureaucrat will look at that a lot easier than if I give them a whole lot of fancy words. So keep it simple and make sure that you also have great design and get people to help edit your stuff so that it is really clear. Second, following up from what also Walter said, is I think business skills are very crucial. And that I'm a social worker as well, and I'm really glad that I grew up in a business family, because I have taken my business skills that I learned up until I went to university, and then I put them together with my social work, and I think we have a new field, Walter. It's called economic social work. So those of us who are social workers are at doing business stuff, we are putting together, we're really good, it's a good background for doing CED. But it's really important that if you don't have that you need to bring in the business people, the marketing people. You need to hire good managers. You need to have making sure that the board, who may have a lot of social general ideas, also gets good training. And one of the things I've noted is that co-ops are really good at teaching people around governance and doing training for their boards. And the last thing is that if we can't do what I think is the best kind of CED, which is locally based strategic planning and organizing, then I think it's really important to organize by sector, so that you take on a food strategy for a community, or fishing, or forestry, or energy, or whatever it is that's going to be a type of business industry, and get lots of stuff happening and lots of support programs, and take a systematic approach to build up that industry, so that then that you've created jobs, you've provided training, and you've got momentum around a particularly important industry area that will help create jobs and grow the local economy. So that's me, talking pretty fast.
Thank you so much, Lynn. Those are some really great things that you've learned from all three of you, actually. So now we're going to shift the discussion to what lies ahead. So we've heard from each of these three pioneers about the changes they've seen over their lives and the lessons they've learned. But we also want to know what they see as the biggest opportunities or strategic areas that the CED movement should be focusing from their perspective, because I mean they have all of this experience and knowledge. So let's come back to Walter. Walter, what do you see from your perspective at Momentum in Calgary?
So I think that we should not take CEDNet for granted, to have that made very clear right at the start here. And I'm not just saying this because I'm at a CCEDNet webinar. It is really critical for us to stimulate our thinking across our provincial boundaries, across the nation. It's so easy in Canada to simply cave into our federation and live in our own little world and forget about the big picture that's happening out there. And CEDNet gives us a place where we can make that happen. So for people to keep plugging into CEDNet is really critical in whichever way seems doable and possible at the time. I think certainly meeting in person is a nice thing to be able to do when the resources are there, but given the kind of difficulties we've had finding sufficient money to do that, I don't, these kind of means are webinars and so forth are good alternatives for us to learn from each other. So that's my first point. The second piece that I've learned that what we tend to do as a sector is we do too much for too little. So my next point of advice is to try and do less for more. Now that's not a very good promise, right? When you go to the funder and you say, you know, I've actually realized that I have far too much on my plate and I'm not getting paid enough. I want to do less and I want you to pay me more. That doesn't work, obviously, right? But at the same time, I think we need to be way smarter about doing the kind of calculations that David did before when he quickly told us that Ontario is investing $100,000 per job in order to get a certain industry to expand. I think in our world, we tend to forget that economic development has some really big numbers attached. And the kind of work that we do saves governments big amounts of money. And we are only as small in many ways as we are thinking in our mind. And often we are held back by a sort of a charity model that all of us, of course, always bemoan. But at the same time, we need to rise beyond that by putting a business hat on and say, okay, who's paying for this in order for us to really make a difference that we can measure and be accountable for. We need to be smart in terms of setting very clear and doable goals. I'm also a big believer in not overselling and then under-delivering or be threatened to under-deliver, but to turn that around and to actually undersell and work hard to be able to over-deliver, because I think over time our credibility goes up. So that's my second, is to try and be more focused, do less, but at the same time make sure that we get paid properly. The third point is making a solid promise, and it's connected to the second one. I'm reminded here of a number of things that I've observed over the years that have tended to over-promise what is possible. I'm not going to name any specifics, but I think we need to be clear in our mind when we market, what it is that we are actually selling. This is back to having a clear business head in addition to having strong social work background. For us to make a good promise, we have to use all the marketing knowledge that is at our fingertips. And when I boil all that down, it comes down to making a promise that is understandable. As Lynne said, something that is easy to grasp in clear language, staying clear of jargon and so forth. But in all the proposals that you're putting forward, ask yourself before you send it in, okay, what is it that I'm promising here that will change as a result of getting this money? And getting that promise right, to not overpromise, to not underpromise, is really critical for us to be able to raise enough money to be able to be sustainable in the long run and make a real difference.
That's some great advice. Thank you, Walter.
You're welcome.
What about you, David?
Well, I think it's interesting for me to kind of look at the opportunities, and one of the things that totally fascinates me, and this has been mentioned by Walter, and it's in the chat room, I really am so encouraged in what young people are doing. I mean, I try to make it a point of engaging when I can and when invited. But I recently, as an example, was a judge on a business competition at Simon Fraser University. And it wasn't about social enterprise. It wasn't about even social entrepreneurship. It was just entrepreneurship. And it was amazing. And I was the only judge on that panel that came from a community economic development or a non-business, purely business model. And of the two that were selected to move forward to the finals, both of them were social purpose businesses that made the best presentation, had the best business case, and they had actually did a great job of integrating the business model. They were business students with a social objective. And so that to me is this kind of transition where, I mean, when I was in university, my joke is always, I'm sure they taught business somewhere, but I have no idea where, because it wasn't in my realm at all. And now I see this whole new integration moving forward with younger people. That's so great. And it matches where I think we're starting to see that purely business separated from the social aspects, it doesn't work. And I think when we take that energy of young people and start to realize that how we've approached things in the past hasn't been the best way because it's been so siloed, that now that we're starting to see that economic opportunities and addressing social issues, the way we separated them doesn't work. So we need to do something different. So we've got this energy, we've got a different perspective, and we've got a whole bunch of new tools in this whole globalization issue. And when I talk about globalization, I look at it from a really positive way. I mean, when I think about the work that I've been able to learn from what's going on in the UK, or to have conversations with colleagues on Skype, or, you know, I'm speaking to a class in Hong Kong and I've done using Skype and using technology to learn from each other and to share, it's just pretty amazing to me. So I think we have some this new energy in young people. We've got a vision that is much more integrated and more reflective of CED values, and we've got a whole new set of tools. So that's where I see the opportunities.
Awesome, thank you. And Lynn?
Oh, sorry, guys. I just went to turn something off. The original question that we had when we started this was about where we see exciting opportunities now. And I have been doing some work with a program that we have at CCA around providing funding to Aboriginal communities to plan cooperatives. And I see a lot of opportunities there. I think it's part of the rebuilding, taking control, having self-sufficiency, and people wanting to get away from being dependent on either government or large corporations. And so what I see is that we need to make sure that CEDNet is including and inviting and bringing to the table in conferences people who are involved in First Nations and Métis communities. There's a fair amount of energy in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, particularly around co-op development, and I think broadly CED. And the other thing is that, as a matter of fact, this is the only federal department that I have found where they're still using the word community economic development, and there seems to be some money there for helping people do strategic planning. Secondly, I think that there's opportunities in food, and this has been going on for quite a while, but I think that in light of the environment, in light of the costs of bringing food in from elsewhere, and the issues around GMOs and all other things, that people are really, really interested in rebuilding food systems in their communities, and that involves the whole range from farming through to retail and processing. And there's, to me, we need to embrace that and make sure that the people who are doing that kind of work are also feeling a part of the CED movement. And I agree with what others have said as well, that engaging youth in developing alternatives to our current economic and social system is a big opportunity, and we need to make sure that youth, university students, younger people in their 20s and 30s know how to do this. And certainly in terms of cooperatives, people are very interested in forming co-ops from this age group, and we're starting to look at how we can better help and reach out and provide some of the practical support to help people start new co-ops.
Thank you very much, Lynn. That was fantastic. You all had great, pointed out some great opportunities, and I also just have to touch on what Walter started with about not taking CCEDNet for granted. And again, I'm not saying this because we are on a CCEDNet webinar, but CCEDNet really was my first introduction to the CED world, and it gave me that clear understanding of that bigger picture and the umbrella that covers all of what CED and social enterprise and cooperatives do. So I think there is a lot of value in finding networks and working with them to promote that. So we're going to move on to the question period, and we'll invite you all to ask any questions you have in the chat box at the bottom right. We are going to start off with, Bonnie had a question around, she posed a question, is there a certain type of training education you would recommend for young adults who are passionate about building a career in this field?
This is David, and I think Walter and Lynn, this whole idea of understanding business, I think is really, really good. I think there's some questions around the pragmatic issues like business, etc. But I think the other piece is really understanding how systems work, and understanding not only the theory of systems, but observing how systems change, and I think that gets back to the concept of persistence, because systems change from multiple influences and processes, and it's not always such a straight line. So I think learning very pragmatic things like how do businesses work, what do people want, what do they need, what are the issues, but also understanding and having a concept of how systems actually change.
It's Lynn here. One of the things that I've found is that university degrees are great, but it's the learning on the ground that's really important. I think internships are important, and I really hope that CCEDNet can continue to do that, because I think it gives people who have a university degree in some area that's pointing towards CED or co-op development and so on, is that then they go and they actually work in the field and if it has to be free, if it has to be no pay, do it, but obviously the paid internships are great. And I think providing going and learning from courses and training that's being put on, unfortunately we don't have the CCEDNet annual conferences anymore, but any opportunity to go out and to be involved in regional CCEDNet events and other things to learn more from people who are already more experienced is a great thing to do. But one of the things that I realized too, same as you, David, I did a social work degree, and guess what? The School of Social Work at the University of Toronto and the School of Business were in the same building, and we didn't even talk to each other. So make sure that you get some business courses and learn about some business finance and business planning and some of those practical skills as well. Go out and go to the events that are happening in your own community around Small Business Week and so on like that, and get to know some of the language and some of that, so you feel comfortable when you're doing whatever projects you're undertaking, which could involve business.
I think all I want to add to that, it's Walter here, is that it's important to understand yourself first, what you're good at among those two disciplines. I think what we're crystallizing out here among the three of us, the ideal education would say, you know, an MBA and an MSW behind your name, even though, you know, I totally agree with what was said before, that the education you get off the rack, as it were, is often not particularly relevant to what we do, but at the same time there are some basic disciplines that really help us. In social work, I learned how to listen, frankly, and some of the business stuff that I took on the ground, I learned how to think about making money. And when you connect those two worlds, it's really powerful what can emerge. And I've seen too many people struggle with one or the other sphere, and therefore not, ending up in endless debates about which approach is more valid. And I think CED has the beauty of really putting the heart and the dollar sign together on each side of a coin. So I would say, importantly, to start with yourself to find out where your weaknesses are in those two areas and go after what you need.
Thank you very much, Walter. Those were all great responses. And Mike's also posted in the chat box a link to some educational resources that are on the CCEDNet website. So feel free to check those out. Going along with sort of the still staying on the topic with some youth before we move on, Robin posed a question. Beyond just a job, how do we support youth leaders to move beyond the youth leader title to leaders in CED? So how do you make that jump? How do you continue the work?
How do you continue? This is David. Let me try. I mean, I think part of it is they are leaders, and I think calling them youth leaders has been sort of a misnomer and almost like one of those things we do, like by saying emerging leaders, etc. Because I think, Yvonne just posted an interesting comment about understanding, democracy and how organizations function, and I think we have to realize that and recognize it definitely from my perspective, it's not age that creates leadership. It's the ability to see an issue and to move on it. And I think we have to change our perception that just because people are young doesn't mean they're not leaders. I think it's our problem. It's what, Walter just said. We have to have the ability, regardless of our experience, and is one of my challenges is always to pay attention and that whole thing that Walter, like learning to listen. Because I think the difficulty is we have this assumption that just because, someone like myself has been doing this a long time, we have some leadership, and it's not leadership by age, it's leadership by action, and I think that's what we have to pay attention to. So age is not the issue. I think it's young people should realize they are the leaders, because I disagree with the term retiring. I call myself retuning, but it's really like they are the leaders, and we have to recognize that.
I kind of I feel with the person that I think what's underneath that question is when will I finally get the opportunity to be a real leader, if you will, or to lead something specific. And I think part of the problem is just the demographic issue that we have such a pronounced baby boom in Canada, and unfortunately many of my age compatriots are not getting out of the way for young people to take over. It's a bit of a risky thing to say, but it's also a comfortable thing to say when my two co-presenters are in the same situation as me. But I think the challenge goes to us, older folks, to get out of the way and let young people truly take the helm and do significant things. At the same time, I would quickly add that often it involves leadership is a risky business, and it involves taking risks and stepping out in front of the crowd, if you will, and be prepared to afterwards be counted, if you will. And so, yeah, have courage and step out, do what needs to be done, and learn from the doing.
Thank you, Walter.
Lynne here. I think all of a sudden I realized that language has made a difference, and I think what's happened is we've defined these things, youth leaders or emerging leaders or youth councils and so on, and we've kind of put in a little corral the younger people, and the old people are still in charge. And I think it may be that we need caucuses, and I know women used to do that too, as a way of getting some strength together to be able to go and join in the broader discussion. But I think it's really important when we have boards and we have events and we have activities that we don't marginalize youth and put them in separate. As a matter of fact, I think that it's important to do the balance between making sure that there are positions on boards for younger people to be involved in governance, and yet at the same time, if youth want to get together in a caucus and elect half of the board, then they should be able to do that as well. They shouldn't be restricted. So I just suddenly realized that it's really important for people who are designing organizations and meetings and participation and so on to stop marginalizing and putting youth in a special category. Let's let them in to be part of the mainstream.
That's a great comment. Thank you, Lynn. And Robin also followed up with saying that they're working on supporting that change in language through an Ontario nonprofit constellation too. So that's great. Sometimes it's just kind of taking back our labels, and I like what you said, Lynn, about just incorporating it across the board. Another question that Indu had asked was, from a marketing standpoint, what tools do you recommend for community-based nonprofits? And we did have, Erin had put a response as well about thinking about places where people gather, such as online at events through newsletters that are already showing up in people's inboxes, basically saying don't reinvent the wheel and make yourself spam. So what would you guys like to add to that question?
On the marketing front, the first thing I would say there is to have, if your group is big enough, reach out to or hire someone that has marketing as, you know, as a background, that has done some mainstream marketing, that really helps in developing, for example, jargon-free presentations, and to be able to speak to the mainstream. So often in not just, of course, the CED field, you know, and all of the professional fields have this problem, is but we depend so much on our ability to convey our message to the mainstream, to really know how marketing actually works, and how it's really about the brain and how we take messages in. But in this day and age, with so many messages coming at us every day, it's critical that we know that we're competing for airtime, and as long as we simply are stuck in our jargon, the mainstream will not hear about us. So bringing people with a marketing background into discussions, whether it is at a time when we do an annual report, or at a time when we, you know, give a speech to a mainstream audience, let them see and help us how we need to connect in a more understandable way.
That's awesome.
It's Lynn. I'm wondering, is this a question about how to sell particular products and services to the local community? Is that what the marketing question is about?
I'm going to let, if Indu, if she wants to clarify a little bit in the chat box.
One of the things that I think we have learned in the co-op movement is there actually is an advantage to describing the business with its values and its advantages to the customer. So we call it the co-op advantage. But it does seem in this day and age that people are wanting to buy products and services that are good, that are well priced, but that may also have some added value. And if that added value is who's working there, if the added value is who owns the company in terms of, say, Daily Foods, which is owned by, 3,000 dairy farmers across Ontario, or how the money profits are being used. Those are all advantages that, along with the mainstream way that you have to describe your products and services through traditional marketing, you also then add value by describing a little bit about what the customer and what the community is going to get as a result of buying from that particular business.
Perfect, thank you. All right, so we're just about out of time, and we've covered a lot of stuff. We're going to turn back to the slides for a second here, and I apologize if anybody's questions didn't get answered, but we can always follow up afterwards as well. We have some links for more information from our presenters, so if you'd like to learn more about the organizations, just follow the links. And if you'd also like to stay in touch around CED-related issues, make sure you check out the CCEDNet website or sign up for our free email newsletters. You also should have just received an email with a link to a 1-minute evaluation survey. Please take a second just to fill that out if you could, because your feedback is very important to us. So finally, thank you once again to Walter, David, and Lynne for sharing their unique perspective and experiences. We definitely do not take what you say for granted. It is valuable insight. And thank you to all the participants for your questions.